Good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Steele, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our conference today. It's great to have you all here and be in this beautiful space. This conference began in my mind earlier this year when Amanda Burden came and described to me the anniversary and how important this was and how we could use this event as a chance to bring wise people together to talk about important issues and learn from the perspective of all the people that are here today. So that's really the plan, and let me first begin by congratulating Amanda and the team at City Planning for all work they've done in the recent past and will do in the future that's so good for all of the city of New York. When you look at the fantastic roster of speakers and the topics that have been assembled for today, hopefully it communicates to you just how seriously all of the Bloomberg administration takes the key issues of city planning and thinking about how to position New York for the 21st century. It's really front of mind for everyone in the administration, led by our Mayor, Michael Bloomberg, and by Amanda Burden. Now, the plan for today was for me to be introducing the mayor, but we've got a bit of an audible, as happens pretty often. He's doing a press conference downtown now, but hopes that he'll be able to join us in just a little bit. So we're going to shake it up a little bit, and if you look at the program, now I have the pleasure of introducing Amanda, who's going to introduce Jerold Kayden, and then hopefully, if things work out, the mayor will be able to join us in just a little while. So that's the plan, and once again, thanks to all of you for giving us your most valuable asset, and that is your time and your judgment. Thanks so very much.
So it's always good for us planners to be agile, and I want to welcome you all here. We have an amazing day of great thinkers and great historians and great journalists and some of the most important decision makers, not only in the country but in the world. I want to first introduce our incredible partners in this effort of bringing this amazing conference off. First, I want to introduce Jerold Kayden, my co-chair from Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and Jack Nyman from Baruch College's Newman Real Estate Institute, who are right here on my left. I want to thank both the GSD and the Institute for their generosity in helping sponsor this conference. And I want to also acknowledge the support of the AIA Center for Architecture and the Mayor's Fund through the Real Estate Board of New York grant. And of the many individuals who have worked incredibly hard at city planning to both conceive of and bring this conference to fruition, I'd like to especially recognize Richard Barth and Cecilia Kushner, who have both given a truly extraordinary measure They have both given an extraordinary measure of passion and intelligence to this effort, and I thank you for your applause, which you anticipated. And I'm going to be speaking right after the mayor, but I wanted to just give these introductory remarks to say that although we at City Planning are all very proud of what we have accomplished over these past years, it has been a hallmark and a mandate of this administration to always look forward, to always continue to anticipate, to try to think differently, to innovate, and to always take on the difficult challenges in order to better prepare the city for the long term. And we're going to be talking a lot about that today. But what we're going to do now, in anticipation of the mayor coming in a little while, I'm going to turn the microphone over to my partner, Jerold Kayden, who is going to help set a framework for planning, for zoning, and for shaping the city. Jerold, will you please come up to the podium?
Thank you very much, Amanda, and welcome indeed on behalf of the Harvard University Graduate School of Design as one of the 3 co-sponsors of this wonderful conference. And Amanda, I do want to say to you, you've made an incredible intellectual and leadership contribution to this conference, and it's greatly appreciated by all of us, so thanks. And it is true, Richard Barth and Cecilia Kushner, amazing people at City Planning, but I also want to say to everybody here from the Department of City Planning, you are truly an amazing planning department. I have worked with many planning departments around the world, and I fear that with several department directors sitting here in the audience, they'll disagree with me when I say this is really the greatest, certainly one of the greatest planning departments anywhere in the entire world. And I know how much you've worked on this conference, but in general work to make this city a better place. Jack Nyman, a co-sponsor with the city and Harvard, has been a terrific collaborator, and his Stephen L. Newman Real Estate Institute is a great asset for New York. And finally, I would like to thank Renee Sachs, who has kept the trains running on time for our conference, and hopefully will continue to do that over the day. And so to my students and faculty colleagues at the Graduate School of Design who are watching this conference today, streaming live, and particularly to my students, yes, you must do the reading tonight for tomorrow's class. So anniversaries are classic hooks for celebration and reflection. But we are here for another reason today. Zoning is actually at a very interesting moment in its evolution. For better and for worse, zoning is still one of the most used techniques for controlling the use and development of land worldwide. In fast-growing cities around the world, planners and political leaders consistently inquire about zoning, and zoning especially as practiced in the United States. And when I give advice to those public officials, as I do, I find it wise and relatively easy to provide examples of failure as well as success. There are several popular critiques today of zoning that are circulating in the zoning world. First, the new urbanists, who see a different vision for cities, condemn traditional zoning and have seized upon zoning reform as one of their key platforms. They have introduced such ideas as form-based codes, and before that, traditional neighborhood development ordinances. Other people criticize city and suburban zoning for constraining growth and thereby driving up the price of land and building. After all, by constraining production of supply, the price of housing and office space goes up, harming middle and lower income families and making cities less competitive. Still others criticize zoning as being overly parochial, captive to neighborhood interests to the detriment of citywide interests. And still others view zoning as captive to local real estate and business interests. Now, how generalizable are these critiques? Are they limited to certain cities, or do they apply to all cities? Are the critiques baked into zoning's DNA, or are they critiques of how zoning has been applied in different places? My talk this morning is meant to highlight some of the key ideas and practices surrounding zoning in modern, large cities. And of course, given the time constraint that I have of 20 minutes, my talk will necessarily be selective. I'll be omitting certain key elements that you might want to hear about, and that might even antagonize you. But I have chosen to discuss 4 propositions. They are the following. First, zoning is not the same as planning. Second, zoning as technique is surprisingly malleable. Third, zoning is no longer principally about old-school physical planning concerns. And fourth, zoning must embrace transparency in the information technology age. So let me start with zoning is not the same thing as planning. Now, there's a lot of history behind that statement. It's really not terribly controversial about keeping planning and plans separate from zoning and the zoning map. Indeed, if you look back at the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act drafted in 1924 by this interesting committee set up by the United States Department of Commerce and then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, that model act to be adopted by states across the country talked about zoning being in accordance with a comprehensive plan. 4 years later, the same Department of Commerce issued the Standard City Planning Enabling Act, which talked about a master plan for the physical development of the territory. And New York State has statutory language, in fact, gleaned directly from those standard acts, and particularly the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. And, for example, calls for regulations to be in accord with a well-considered plan. But the reality across the country, and even supporting judicial decisions, have collapsed planning and zoning into one thing. Zoning is often the plan. And for lawyers, that means, guess what? It's in accordance with itself. Now, in discussing zoning, it is important, in my view, to distinguish between praising or criticizing the planning decision underpinning the zoning and praising or criticizing the specific mechanics of the technique itself. This may indeed sound like a distinction without a difference, but I don't think it is. What do we mean when we say Boston or San Francisco or Denver or Washington, D.C., to name but a few, or Shanghai for that matter, has great zoning or terrible zoning? Are we praising or criticizing the technique itself, or are we praising or criticizing the planning that is then implemented by the zoning? There's too much down zoning, or there's too much up zoning. That's really simply shorthand for a discussion about the merits or demerits of density and community character. Zoning really, at the end of the day, oversimplified as an analogy perhaps, but it's a thermostat. And we decide what temperature we want the city to be at, and then we set the zoning thermostat to that temperature. Planning, in short, is much bigger than zoning. It's comprehensive, it's creative, and it's an enterprise that attempts to deal with many different facets. We want to plan our cities to be productive, equitable, sustainable, and wonderful places. So let's argue about density and not about zoning, unless there is something to argue about with zoning. Then let's think deeply about the toolkit of implementation. Zoning is one of the tools. Public investment in infrastructure is another. Tax policy, economic development policy, and other regulations. To plan is human, to implement divine, I like to say. But I'd suggest that divinity is much larger than zoning. My second proposition is that zoning as technique is surprisingly malleable. Now, this isn't always appreciated. Indeed, zoning can be very, very sticky and very hard to change, just as all laws are, and they develop constituencies that indeed support them. They're there, and do we really have to change? Zoning has relied for many, many years and decades on a trio, the zoning trio of regulating use, shape, and bulk. And it has done that through zones. After all, that's why it's called zoning. Now, is that trio of use, shape, and bulk restrictions set in stone? Are zones, in fact, required by zoning? Well, Richard Babcock, a very eminent late great lawyer, wrote The Zoning Game in 1966, and he said, quote, "Too many techniques have been elevated to the status of principles. Districting is no more a principle than a statutory 35-mile-per-hour speed limit is a principle." So what are some examples of malleability that makes us realize that zoning is indeed incredibly flexible? Well, one of them is form-based zoning, which I already mentioned in terms of new urbanism. Form-based zoning challenges the zoning trio. It places its full faith and credit in shape restrictions. In short, the zoning envelope, rather than its contents, is what matters. Function follows form. Let the market then determine what goes inside buildings. And form-based zoning, which is indeed practiced now around the country, Miami and Denver are two of the latest examples of cities that have adopted it, although they do have some use restrictions, by the way, still prevailing. But form-based zoning does push us to ask the question, should use be relatively unrestricted in zoning? Indeed, should we do away with the use restriction in zoning and turn that trio into a duo? Maybe mixed use is indeed the default position. Another aspect of malleability in zoning is its administration. And this falls into the grand debate of rule versus discretion. The American tradition of zoning, emanating from 19th century German zoning, has usually been based on rules. The British tradition, out of the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 and subsequent acts, relies on discretion or planning permission. In reality, both regimes have been, meeting somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We're much more discretionary now, and the British tradition, practiced in the UK and elsewhere, is much more as of right. Well, rules, sometimes called as of right or matter of right zoning, simply require ministerial review. Somebody makes sure that the applicant, the developer, has dotted the I's and crossed the T's, whereas discretion, of course, involves case-by-case, substantive, judgmental decision-making. Now, there's no right answer to this great debate, but it does point out the malleability of administering zoning through one of those two great regimes. There are arguments on both sides. For rules, rules deliver certainty for developers and lenders, leading to lower costs. Rules are easier to administer, since high-level administrative staff is less necessary. Rules are less susceptible to improper insertions of influence, political connections, and co-optation. Rules force planners to think about planning in a more comprehensive, futuristic way, without the pressures of the specific decision at hand. Rules can be creative. There's a marvelous book by Alex Lehner called Grand Urban Rules that lays out all sorts of fanciful approaches. But don't think that rules are axiomatically simple. If you look at form-based zoning rules, they're quite detailed in what they require, quite prescriptive. And special zoning districts have been used to map very specific parcel-by-parcel prescriptions for built form and amenities. And New York has been one of the great laboratories for this, going back to the late 60s, and the urban design group set under then-Mayor Lindsay pioneered this approach with the special Lincoln Square district, the special Fifth Avenue district, and most remarkably, the special Greenwich Street Development District, now amended, but with an enormous amount of very specific parcel-by-parcel rules. Even contextual zoning, to some degree, can be rule-based in that it takes its cues from the surrounding context, but obviously leads to different outcomes depending on the context. Now, those in favor of discretion argue something quite different. Discretion recognizes the impossibility of reducing the qualities that make for well-designed urban environments to rules. Discretion avoids letter-of-the-law compliance. It's flexible and temporally nimble in a world of rapid and often unpredictable change. Discretion allows for the very negotiated engagements and collaborative inventiveness with developers and their representatives, potentially resulting in a win-win outcome. Discretion, by the way, is often favored by those who have invested the time and energy in learning the navigation skills needed for discretionary approval. Well, can a true as-of-right system really exist? Some of our colleagues here today from Boston and San Francisco, for example, might think one is from a different planet to be suggesting a truly rule-based system. But it is something worth exploring, and in this malleable zoning world, it's possible. Now, perhaps the most malleable version of zoning is one that derives from the notion of performance-based zoning. It's the least ground-tested, but perhaps the most provocative example of this malleability, because it says that there is no need for the mediating language of traditional zoning, no need for the zoning trio, no need for the traditional zoning argot. Developers, designers, and engineers are allowed to devise creative solutions to achieve ultimate goals that the city is trying to achieve. Now, it's easy to understand, or at least easier to understand, performance zoning and how it might work when it comes to environmental issues. As long as the building meets certain measurable performance standards, who cares how it does it? If heavy industry and residential can live cheek by jowl without noise and smell, so be it. We don't have to divide them out. But imagine performance standards that are truly qualitative. And allow your imagination to run wild here. Imagine a standard encouraging or requiring a built environment, advancing competitiveness, or equity, or sustainability, or beauty. And by the way, it doesn't refer to use, shape, or bulk. Now, I already hear the snickers. You've been very nice, but I hear them anyway. It would be ridiculous, too difficult for developers to respond to, for planners to assess, for courts to judge. But I would argue that it's the very idea of being so direct about what we are really striving to achieve, without mediating language, that makes qualitative performance zoning so alluring and thus so worthy of further exploration. My third proposition is that zoning is no longer principally about old-school physical planning concerns. That's not really a new idea anymore because the old school has been let out. Zoning for social equity, for design excellence, for livability are now deeply embedded within zoning's ambit. It wasn't always the case. It even still surprises people today and certainly worldwide. But let me discuss a few examples, familiar and less familiar. So on the familiar front is inclusionary zoning. Okay, terrific. Okay, thanks. Inclusionary zoning and linkage encourage or require new development to provide or pay for affordable housing. New Yorkers are very familiar with inclusionary zoning. It's called inclusionary housing here. And there are lots of examples nationally of this. Linkage actually pushes the model to office development and requires office developers to pay money into a housing trust fund. Incentive zoning achieves all sorts of amenities of public space and theaters and community centers and libraries and affordable housing and other sorts of social amenities. Better design is commonly obtained now through zoning, through the specific technique of design review, whether it's administered by design guidelines or in case-by-case review. And certainly the current chair has pioneered, if you will, design as a crucial part of review of buildings. Zoning for sustainability is now the new frontier. How different would a zoning ordinance look if it were keyed primarily to sustainability, the merging of environmental controls with zoning controls? Briefly, my fourth proposition, and then I end. Zoning must embrace transparency in the technological information age. Does anyone really know what the local zoning ordinance says? Have cities created behemoths of substance and process, like the Internal Revenue Code, that make even experts occasionally fumble? Too often, zoning does seem to be written in a foreign language and decipherable only to the brilliant, specialized zoning lawyers and planners. And zoning is complicated. But zoning also needs to be transparent. And transparency is made remarkably possible by new developments in technology. New York has its new zoning handbook, which is terrific. And geographic information systems that spatialize data by location, including data about zoning decisions, can make it possible to understand and analyze zoning in new ways, and indeed to actually conduct zoning audits where one really begins to understand how it is used, what costs and benefits it imposes, how it reflects different planning agendas, what property rights it conveys or removes, etc. And thus we can answer the question, finally, who controls zoning and who is benefited by it. So in conclusion, I've addressed some, but hardly all of the important ideas and trends in modern-day zoning. Being an inherently local institution, zoning will vary based on a city's history, economics, politics, culture, demographics, and so forth. And any attempt to boil zoning down to a set of generic propositions, as I've just done to some degree, runs the risk of detaching the technique from its true roots as a means to an end, with that end uniquely situated and suited for its unique physical environment. But framing the discussion through broader ideas can indeed lead to comparisons and ultimately to innovation. Zoning can't do everything, but so many years after its introduction, right here in New York City in 1916 in terms of the United States, zoning still holds promise. So I say in closing to all of us here, see you in 50 years to learn just what's happened to zoning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerold. It takes a lot of courage to tell people you're going to make 4 points these days and then have the confidence that you're going to remember all 4 of them. The great thing about a city like New York is there are always things going on, and Mayor Bloomberg has been detained. He is just finishing a press conference now, so I think what we're going to do is continue on with the program, and there's some chance he'll join later today, but I don't think we can count on it given everything that he's got. So my plan now is to share with you the gist of what he wanted to say, to try to frame the conference and lay things out and try to provide a perspective. And so if you can just allow me to try to talk you through this, as the mayor would want to review with you, then I'll do my best. I think that the mayor would want to tell you that when he thought about this 10 years ago, that basically people weren't sure about the position of New York. It was 10 years ago that Amanda Burden joined the administration when New York City was still reeling after the 9/11 attacks. And basically what we've seen is at that time people thought all over that New York might never recover. And in fact, Mayor Bloomberg said at the time that he'd rather have New York's hand to play than anyone else's. And some people thought he was boastful, but I like to say I think instead he's proven to be prescient. And a good person who was side by side with the mayor throughout all of this was Amanda Burden in the city planning group. Many people have seen that New York has not only survived, but really prospered, and the evidence is all around you. The commercial real estate market in New York is the strongest in the nation. We've regained 90% of the jobs lost during the national recession. And people are voting about New York with their feet. We see people want to live, work, and visit in New York, and the evidence is all around us. The population today is at an all-time high of 8.4 million, and we see and are beginning to plan for another 1 million people moving to New York by 2035. What Amanda and all the team in city planning have done to frame all of this and help us think about it has been critical. They all understand New York and all great cities have to have things in common. They grow and change with changing times, and in that spirit, they've used the 1961 zoning resolution, whose birthday we're here celebrating, to carefully and creatively resculpt the city. To date, they've steered 114 rezonings through New York City's Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, known as ULUP, and with great success. These rezonings and other major projects they've accomplished cover almost 37% of the land area of all 5 boroughs. By far the most extensive reshaping of the city in the last 50 years. And that's really an astonishing accomplishment in and of itself, almost 40% of the city having been rezoned. And what's more striking is not just the fact of the rezoning, but what that's done to basically change and adjust and make New York more competitive for the future. And the way we think about it, it's not each individual aspect, but the sum of the parts and what it's created is even more important. Because of these efforts, we've dramatically recast the future of the entire city in 4 major ways that in today's conference will address. Making New York more economically competitive, more equitable, more aesthetically pleasing, and more sustainable. And that's all continuing today. Because today, also, the mayor plans to announce a comprehensive new set of green zoning proposals, which we'll talk about a bit more in a few minutes. Now, in terms of economically competitive, what we mean is a better home for people of all income levels, improving the quality of life, and also increase the environmental sustainability for the years ahead. But the past is prologue, and so let's talk about what we intend to do and how we think about our accomplishments to date. And that really starts with how making New York a far more competitive city, one that's better equipped to succeed in the rough and tumble world, which we've all seen is the reality of today's global economy. To do that, we've zeroed in on what we view as long underused land throughout the city, and combining zoning policy with targeted public investment have begun unlocking this potential of this property to create jobs and make the economy continue to grow. It means jobs in restaurants and entertainment, offices and shops, and of course jobs in construction. Our work has ranged from Willits Point to downtown Brooklyn, and from Coney Island to an area where an important engine of New York's future is moving into high gear. And that's Hudson Yards in the Manhattan's far west side. 6 years ago, the City Council approved our proposed extensive rezoning of more than 60 square blocks around the Hudson Yards. The first step toward making it a vibrant new mixed-use community and an extension of Midtown's central business district. Because we know that when mass transit blazes the way, Private development follows. We've also financed and begun building the first major addition to the New York City subway system in many, many years. The extension of the number 7 line from Times Square right into the Hudson Yards area is set for completion about 2 years from today. I know because I've been down and seen that the cavern and the new station all look terrific, and the mayor is excited about taking a ride on this new train before he leaves office. The result is clear. Last week, we broke ground on $555 million worth of new housing that's going up on a tract of the West Side that's been vacant for more than 45 years. And the week before, we announced plans for the first major office tower to go up in the Hudson Yards area, 1.8 million square feet of a fantastic new building. Together, these projects will produce thousands of construction jobs in the very near future. The leading edge of thousands more jobs to come in an entirely new community and the largest transit-oriented new development in our nation, and that's going to help to define New York City's future. Second, we're also making New York a more equitable city. Most of you know that New York is in the midst of the largest affordable housing initiative ever undertaken by any American city, a commitment to create and preserve enough housing for 500,000 people by the year 2014. Our goal is to keep New York a city for people of all income levels, and zoning, specifically inclusionary zoning, has been a key element of our strategy to accomplish just that. In a nutshell, inclusionary zoning doesn't impede the private housing market. Instead, we believe it incentivizes the market. It allows developers to build more, so long as producing more affordable housing is part of the bargain. In some communities where inclusionary zoning has been employed, such as Greenpoint and Williamsburg, affordable units now make up as much as a third of the new housing that's being built or planned. That creates affordable housing where it might not otherwise exist. And it promotes the kind of ethnic and economic diversity that defines urban living at its best. Third, we've used rezoning to make New York a more physically attractive and inviting city, one with an unsurpassed quality of life. A few minutes ago, I spoke about unlocking the economic potential of overlooked parts of our city. The same can be said about tapping into the neglected recreational and aesthetic potential of all of the city's assets. This certainly includes much of New York's beautiful and often sorely mistreated 520 miles of shoreline along the bays and rivers. When people first came to New York, they dreamed of moving inward and upward in the island of Manhattan. Today, our goal is to take them back to the edge of the water to live and enjoy and also have a viable commerce at the same place. Opening up our waterfront to the public is one of Amanda's great passions, and all of the administration is looking forward to following her. On our watch, we've created more than 370 acres of new waterfront parks and some 20 miles of new shoreline greenways along, for example, the rezoned East River waterfront of Greenpoint and Williamsburg. In the same vein, we have, through rezoning, led the reclamation of what just 10 years ago was considered a derelict eyesore, a rusting relic of the past that everyone thought absolutely had to be demolished. Of course, I'm speaking of the High Line. It's to Amanda's everlasting credit, and we all enjoy it whenever we go, to see that when she looked and saw the High Line, she saw something that could be better and infinitely more exciting for the whole area. She took the lead in transforming it into what it is today, the most visually stimulating and most widely discussed new city park, not just in New York, but in all of the country and outside the borders of the United States. It's done everything a park should do and even more. It's catalyzed some $2 billion in new private investment along the path, 30 projects, 22 of which are built, 4 of which are coming out of the ground, and 4 on the drawing board are what's going on right now in that area. It's also become an international destination and burnished New York's reputation as a place that's looking forward to the future. The fourth point I'd want to mention, and finally, our rezonings are also creating a more sustainable city. And that really illustrates how we thoroughly modified the 1961 zoning resolution, which envisioned a future of automobile-dependent development in New York's periphery. And instead, and in keeping with our Plan NYC sustainability agenda, we're now encouraging transit-oriented development. Hudson Yards, which I previously mentioned, is the gold star example of that plan. We've also pursued that goal through rezonings of Coney Island, along Harlem's 125th Street, and in the St. George area of Staten Island. And in what's destined to become one of New York City's largest middle-income communities in the long-abandoned industrial area of Hunters Point on the East River waterfront of Queens. In fact, the new ferry service launched earlier this year that serves Hunters Point has already proven wildly popular with residents all along the East River in Queens and Brooklyn. Transit-oriented development is good policy, both environmentally and economically. And so are the city's comprehensive new green zoning proposals, which will go out for public review next month. They'd remove current regulations that impede new construction of green buildings and also, very importantly, discourage or prevent energy-efficient retrofits in existing buildings. Installing solar panels and sun-controlled shades and awnings, creating green roofs, building rooftop greenhouses where fresh local produce can be grown. All would become easier for developers and the current building owners. And that would not only further shrink our carbon footprint, it would create construction jobs in making the building upgrades. It would improve the quality of the air we breathe by reducing our dependence on electrically generated by using fossil fuels. And also cut energy costs for business, residential landlords, and the individual homeowners too. So that's a good note for me to make the final point for this morning, and that's the rezoning goals I've just ticked through, making New York more competitive, equitable, aesthetically pleasing, and environmentally sustainable. And in no way are these four ambitions mutually exclusive, but instead they come together and support each other. This complementarity is what we're really focused on in the administration. Keeping New York a livable city with a strong quality of life, diversifying the economy, and replacing a Manhattan-centric economic focus with a strategy that builds on the assets and creates jobs in all 5 of our boroughs. And that's the plan we're trying to chart for New York's future. So let me review now and say thank you for everything and listening today, and now I'm going to give it back over to Amanda, who will provide her remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for your extraordinary support. It's been almost 10 years now that the mayor set forth his vision and his goals for making our city a truly great city. And we at City Planning have tried to implement those far-reaching objectives through a versatile instrument, an instrument that is proven to be at once agile, yet flexible, powerful, and precedent-breaking. An instrument that is the subject of today's conference, an instrument that is called zoning. The purpose of today's conference is to look beyond this administration's tenure, to put New York City in a global context, to ask how we can set the right stage for the city to prosper, to compete, and to flourish for generations to come. For instance, how can we best continue to attract talent and investment? How can we best offer opportunity for all? We should ask, what might be the new environmental issues of these next coming decades? And what are the greatest obstacles to becoming the world's most dynamic metropolis? We have brought together today some of the most influential decision makers in city making worldwide to debate the challenges that are before us in the decades to come, and to set forth certain markers to help chart a path for a forward-thinking city. How zoning fits into the ideal of a great city and the role it can play in developing solutions is the charge of our afternoon panel. As we know, and as Jerold explained, zoning is not planning. Zoning is a tool which is used to implement a vision and a plan. Zoning can mandate, or incentivize, prohibit, or encourage a wide spectrum of objectives for making a more resilient and productive city. In the past years, we have tried to reshape and expand zoning so that it is constantly responsive to changing conditions. We have used zoning for initiatives as diverse as incentivizing neighborhood grocery stores or requiring secure bicycle parking. We use zoning now to ensure great public open spaces. And zoning has channeled the city's growth so that now almost 90% of new development is within a 10-minute walk of a subway. And next month, as Bob mentioned, we will launch Zone Green, the most comprehensive effort to sweep aside obstacles to green buildings in our zoning. We have demonstrated that with vision and expertise, zoning can do more than regulate size and use. It can also achieve important goals for an evolving city. Today is a crucial next step in the process for zoning innovation. The purpose of this conference is not to celebrate or evaluate past zoning achievements, but to present a forum for new ideas on how zoning, as distinct from other tools of local government, may be used to address the needs of present and future generations of New Yorkers. Not every topic will be able to be covered. We have chosen those most relevant to New York City and its future challenges. Zoning is the language of the city. And today's agenda is to add a new glossary to augment our current language and collectively begin to prepare for the future of an ever greater New York City. And if you want to do it in 140 characters or less, you can tweet throughout the day using #ZoningTheCity. I want to thank you, and I want to invite Jerold Kayden to come back to the podium to introduce our first fantastic panel. Jerold, will you come back?
So I'd like to call up our first four panelists, if you'd please come up here for This Is Your Life. While they're doing that, I'd like to introduce this panel, which is indeed called, as you can see, Shaping New York City Through Zoning, 1961 to the Present. We'll first hear from Hilary Ballon, who is Deputy Vice Chancellor, NYU Abu Dhabi, as well as University Professor of Urban Studies and Architecture at NYU. Please join us on stage. Then we'll hear from Carol Willis, who is the founder, director, curator of the Skyscraper Museum in New York, and adjunct associate professor of urban studies. And finally, we'll hear from Alex Garvin, who is professor of urban planning and management adjunct at Yale University and president and CEO of AGA Public Realm Strategies. Now, they'll be talking about the historical context and vision of zoning first, then the zoning resolution in 1961 second, and finally the new approaches under the 61 zoning resolution. Each has 15 minutes. They've been instructed to adhere to that, and timekeeping is very strict here, I've learned, or even stricter than I've thought. And then Rick Bell, who is the executive director of the American Institute of Architects in New York, will moderate a discussion up here first, then questions and answers from the audience, and he will be very strict with the audience. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm going to take you back in time. May I have the first slide, please? Thank you. Until the passage of the 1961 zoning resolution, New York City was nowhere in terms of planning. It had an ineffective planning commission, which had not one major accomplishment since it was established in 1938. New York had the prolific, domineering, and fearsome Robert Moses, the master builder who was hostile to planning, and at every opportunity blocked comprehensive planning efforts. In 1960, New York had no master plan and a zoning resolution that was obsolete by all accounts. New York had been pioneering in 1916 when it passed the nation's first zoning resolution, but that leadership role was a distant memory by mid-century. In the intervening 40 years, efforts to update the resolution had been thwarted, leaving the city without a coherent approach to myriad challenges in urban life since World War I. In 1956, things began to change because planning found an effective pair of champions. Mayor Robert Wagner, who was committed to zoning reform since his own stint as chairman of the City Planning Commission in 1948, and James Felt on the right, a civic-minded real estate man whom Wagner appointed to head the Planning Commission. From his first day in office, Felt declared that the overhaul of New York's antiquated zoning law was his mission. It took 5 years to accomplish that mission. The struggle to rezone New York was officially won when the City Planning Commission unanimously voted for the new zoning resolution in October, followed by the Board of Estimate in December 1960. To place you in time between those two page one events, John F. Kennedy was elected president. To give some historical context to today's proceedings, let me sketch the struggle to rezone New York, which shaped the outcome, the argument for rezoning, and the urban vision of the zoning reform. The struggle to rezone. Within a decade of its passage, there were complaints that the 1916 zoning resolution failed to address current urban dynamics, but they led nowhere. When the City Planning Commission was established in 1938, Chairman Rexford Tugwell, an economist and New Dealer who had been part of Roosevelt's Brain Trust, attempted to establish a master plan and in the zoning arena eliminate non-conforming uses, but his efforts were soundly defeated. As one observer put it, with no master plan, zoning continued as the functional equivalent of comprehensive planning in New York. The next rezoning effort in 1944 called for significant reductions in bulk provisions. Surprisingly, amazingly, Robert Moses led this effort, but his reform didn't pass. This overlooked episode belies the myth of Moses's invincibility, but Moses himself did not forget this defeat. Never again did he support zoning reform and position himself in opposition to real estate interests. The real starting point of the 1961 rezoning was 1948, when under the chairman Robert Wagner Jr., the City Planning Commission hired the firm of Harrison, Ballard, and Allen to develop a new zoning resolution. Harrison and Ballard came from the New York City Housing Authority, and their vision of the city was firmly anchored in the superblock solution, with freestanding towers surrounded by light, air, and open space. Dyckman Houses on the right was designed by Harrison shortly before he undertook the planning study. The plan for rezoning the city of New York, published in 1950, was of exceptional quality. It visualized the argument for new zoning rules and introduced significant new ideas, many of which were carried over into the 61 zoning resolution. The frontispiece of the zoning study exemplifies the models and core commitments to open space. At the top is Glen Oak Village, a garden apartment complex at the city line in Queens, the residential development of Stuyvesant Town you'll recognize at the lower left, and at the right is a model of Lever House, which was completed 2 years after the study was published in 1952. Instead of regulating bulk based on the width of the street, as in the 1916 resolution, Harrison Ballard introduced the relatively new planning metric of floor area ratio, which Carol Willis will drill into in her paper. The cover of the study summarized how the FAR approach would change the profile of skyscrapers. where the 1916 zoning resolution on the left set the maximum height of the street, then required the upper floors to step back in slender towers covering no more than 25% of the lot. The FAR provision lowered the street wall but permitted larger floor plates on the upper floors. Moreover, instead of relying on setbacks to provide light and air, Harris and Ballard proposed an open space ratio and a required angle of light, which they argued would give architects greater flexibility of design. Lacking comprehensive data about the city, Harris and Ballard and Allen tracked 850,000 properties. For this massive effort, specially designed IBM punch cards were used to keep track of the city's land use in relation to zoning. This initial step to compile land use data gives you a sense of the information deficit and rudimentary systems in place in 1950. Mayor O'Dwyer described the Harris and Ballard study as the most constructive activity of his administration, which doesn't say much for his mayoralty, because by 1953 the plan was shelved and nothing happened. While civic groups supported the plan, real estate interests objected to the bulk restrictions and the proposed elimination of non-conforming uses. The zoning effort was resurrected in 1956 after a 3-year hiatus by James Felt, the unusually effective chairman of the commission from 1956 to 1963. Felt's achievements, in my view, have been unduly overlooked, perhaps because he was overshadowed by Moses, but that also makes his achievements all the more impressive. In addition to the comprehensive rezoning of New York City, Felt was responsible for the West Side Urban Renewal Project, a project that Moses, the city's urban renewal czar, steadfastly opposed. In contrast to Moses's reliance on site clearance, Felt piloted a new approach, including spot clearance, historic preservation, and retention of the grid. And he set urban renewal in New York on a new path. Were it not for Felt's masterful guidance, it is doubtful that the 61 zoning resolution would have been passed. Felt hired the architectural firm of Voorhees, Walker, Smith & Smith to survey the city again and draft a new resolution. The work was directed by Jack C. Smith, who hired a group of young talents, including Paul Davidoff, who would subsequently develop the concept of advocacy planning, and Francis Fox Piven, who would do pioneering work on poverty at the University of Chicago. Moses, as always, colorfully expressed his constitutional objection to planning. There are plenty of limited objectives to pursue, he opined, without heading straight for the millennium. I'm for making the smaller, less dramatic advances scorned by the demon planners. Moses specifically attacked FAR, rezoning close to 1 million parcels of land on the basis of an alphabetical slogan needs a lot of explanation. But Felt was a deft operator, and with Wagner's backing, he sidelined Moses and dismantled the opposition on all fronts through relentless compromise. The Voorhees-Walker plan, titled Zoning New York City, was released in 1958. After public hearings, more than 300 changes were made in the plan. A revised resolution was released about a year later, in December 1959. A second round of hearings was followed by 850 changes before a third and final version was released in August 1960. A total of 1,150 changes were made, the large number indicative of Felt's determination to disarm opponents. The general effect of the changes was to increase bulk limits in commercial districts and to increase restrictions to protect residential districts with 1- and 2-family homes. It is perhaps ironic, the New York Times commented, that the zoning resolution should have as its most zealous advocate a man whose business was spent in real estate brokerage. Felt's real estate credentials were an important ingredient in his success. He appreciated and was responsive to the industry's concerns, and at an early point in the review process, assuaged developers by guaranteeing a 1-year grace period before the zoning law went into effect. The grace period was eventually twice extended so that the 1961 zoning resolution did not actually go into effect until 1963. The two key zoning studies of the 1950s made the same strong case for rezoning. First, it was necessary to base zoning on a scientific basis and thorough understanding of existing land uses. The 1916 resolution was not based on empirical data, no population studies, no land use data, no economic forecasting, and it made mad assumptions. The total permitted bulk for a residential the total permitted bulk provided for a residential population of 55 million and a working population of 300 million. As Harrison Ballard wrote, regulations such as these obviously exert no control at all throughout most of the city. A particular concern, this slide from the Harrison Ballard study, was overzoning for retail and business use outside Manhattan, resulting in stores that were scattered and vacant, and good street frontage was reserved for a future business unlikely to materialize. With the current zoning, the permitted degree of development in most districts had no relation either to existing land uses or future needs. Second, new zoning resolutions were required to meet the conditions of modern urban life. The city had no coherent approach to automobiles or airports, to superblock projects, the requirements of modern skyscrapers, and the rise of shopping centers and supermarkets. No planning response to the loss of 500,000 middle-class residents who moved to the suburbs in the 1950s alone, and the influx of African Americans and Latinos into poor neighborhoods. No response to the loss of manufacturing jobs or the demise of the port. Public housing, here you see the Fort Greene houses in Brooklyn. Title I urban renewal and highway construction brought about sweeping changes in New York in the years after World War II, but zoning had little to say about these dynamics. And then outside Manhattan, residents and planners were worried about too much density. The perception was that overdevelopment and residential congestion encouraged the middle-class flight to the suburbs, a diagnosis that pointed to open space and automobile access as a retention cure. Simplification was another reason for rezoning. It may seem like a fantasy to simplify zoning, but the 1916 resolution had become a labyrinth. It recorded height, use, and area restrictions in 3 different maps and had acquired 2,500 amendments. The 1950 rezoning studies presented one unified map with 47 districts, a merciful reduction from the 286 districts in the prevailing system. The newspapers closely covered the decade-long campaign to rezone New York City, but they failed to explain the zoning code in layman's terms. Zoning was presented in increasingly technical terms, with FAR and other metrics making zoning yet more of an expert's game. Yet an urban vision decidedly informed the 61 zoning resolution, a vision that was more retrospective in outlook than responsive to the currents bubbling up in 1960. At a time when the population of New York was just shy of 8 million, the zoning resolution resized the city for a maximum population of 12 million. While a dramatic reduction from the 55 million people implied by the 1916 resolution, the ceiling had creeped up in the 1950s from 8.6 million in the Harrison Ballard proposal of 1950 to 10 million in the first Voorhees Walker proposal before settling on 12 million in 1960. This upward creep in response to developer pressure to increase bulk. The use of floor area ratios to set bulk provisions was momentous. The FAR control made it possible to have up to 55% tower coverage on a site rather than the previous maximum of 25%. It was not economic for developers to build these small setback floors permitted by the 1916 resolution, whereas the FAR formula allowed bigger floor plates. This is the page from the Voorhees-Walker report, which points to the Seagram building on the left and Lever House on the right as models for the new skyscraper. Sure. The 1961 zoning resolution responded to the omnipresent automobile by requiring off-street parking and the desirability of the automobile by this time was Main Street wisdom. The mounting objections to rampant automobility, voiced, for example, by Jane Jacobs and Victor Gruen, and soon heralded by the bike-riding Mayor Lindsay, did not register at all in the zoning discussions. During the zoning hearings, protesters gathered in Washington Square to ban cars from the park, and they prevailed. This was Jane Jacobs' first protest. In 1961, Jacobs published The Death and Life of the Great American City, which, as you know, formulated a new urban paradigm. It entailed the rejection of superblocks and segregated land uses, the view of streets as social spaces, not only as conduits for cars, the reassertion of the pedestrian, and the affirmation of old-fashioned New York streets. These values, which set the agenda for enlightened planning in the next generation, stood in opposition to the urban vision of the 1961 zoning resolution and its commitment to the detached tower superblock urbanism and the automobile. So to conclude, as the culmination of a 40-year effort to rezone this city, the 1961 zoning resolution understandably had legacy features more responsive to the issues of the preceding decades than the emergent concerns of 1960. Nevertheless, it reframed the concept of zoning and laid the groundwork for the innovative uses of bonus zoning that would be developed in the 1960s and continue to this day. Thank you.
Hello, it's an honor to be here. Thanks very much. And as you can see, Hilary has set up a tremendous sweep of the history, and zoning is sweep, and I'm going to try to take some of the same themes and drill down into something quite much more specific. Can I see my, how do I get my first slide? There it is. Oh. So the assignment I've been given today is to outline and explain the new approaches of the 1961 zoning resolution as enacted and how it changed the game in the city. Given the constraints of time, my approach will be highly reductive. In fact, I'm going to focus on three little words. You can probably guess what they are. Can anybody guess what they are? FAR. FAR, or open space. Floor area ratio, or open space. But first, for flavor, let's get a little history under our belts with a series of slides with some images of the various reports, additional ones than Hilary has already shown us over the decade of the development of zoning. So just simply to review, and here you'll see in not tremendous slides in some cases, as you can maybe perhaps see, June 1949, the first Harrison, Ballard, and Allen analysis, and some bad images that came from the Regional Plan Association, because these are iPhone archive photos, as you will see in many cases. And I wanted to, and an even better cover of this fabulous survey. This is my favorite image, and the orange inspired my title page, my title screen. The analysis of Harrison, Ballard, and Allen, followed then by Voorhees, Walker, Smith, and Smith. This is Allen. In the late 1950s, from 1956, and here you see some of the same images in the pages. Now the documents have been put online in many cases by the Department of City Planning, and just recently, in fact, too recently for them to have been included in my talk. And you can see the tremendous amount of detail and the vast amount of analysis that's gone into the surveys of every acre of the city, as Hilary described. And this daunting detail that was created in order to develop the simplified single map that was the mantra of the zoning effort in two views. And then how to read the map is one of the pages from a document that's in the collection of the Skyscraper Museum and is not yet online. And I want to look at it for a moment because this rezoning New York City, which was developed by the Voorhees, Walker, Smith, and Smith Group in 1959-60, was released as the layman-friendly explanation of the motives of zoning. And it's these images that I'm going to use in order to characterize their fundamental underlying values that's really the subject of my talk. And the typescript page that's over on the left, this document was given to the museum by the late Sid Frigand, who died last May, who had worked for the Planning Commission as well as the Port Authority. And because I haven't encountered this particular document in any of the other archives that I've visited, I'm particularly happy and grateful to him because I think that it illuminates in a way that you can't penetrate through all of the charts and graphs and maps in the previous documents that I showed you, the motives that underlay this project. So, floor area ratio. The concept and the formulas was a radically new idea applied to the regulation and the form and volume of an individual building. But before we get into the particulars, though, let's examine FAR as an expression of the fundamental values that drove the effort to reform and modernize the 1916 zoning law. Planners wanted to dramatically reduce the city's maximum density. This chart, which was developed by the City Planning Commission in 1959 for this public relations brochure on rezoning the city, does not use the word density, but rather population and zoned capacity. But density is what they meant, and in two ways: the crowding of populations and the total amount of buildable area and volume allowed by the height and bulk controls of the former and future zoning. The graphic illustrates the reduction in density recommended by the new zoning resolution, a reduction of about 80% over what the City Planning Commission and their consultants calculated to be the zoned capacity under the 1916 laws, as Hilary was also describing. So that number, and one which is certainly open to debate on its assumptions, was a theoretical, rounding off now, 55.6 million people crammed into an imaginary full build-out of all the lots in the city to their maximum zoning envelope. In contrast, their proposed FAR limited code would allow for a zone capacity of 11.8 million. Those are the bar graphs over on the right-hand side. Capacity 11.8 million, and at the time, in 1957, the city's census counted about 7.8 million people. So FAR, in the words of the City Planning Commission, was a simple, direct, and enforceable control over the physical volume of buildings. It was applicable to all types of structures and could be applied in all districts, in residence, commercial, and manufacturing, which were the new districts described by the 1916 law. As these 1955 illustrations show, the developer was allowed to arrange the maximum allowable FAR on the site however he preferred. But what the City Planning Commission preferred was the taller option that provided more open space. In fact, they so preferred open space around buildings that they gave bonus FAR for it. The examples here, with the typically daunting chart, next, refer to residential buildings. We don't really have time to go into detail on the impact of zoning in the residential neighborhoods, though Hilary alluded to all of that and illustrated it. So let's just use the words and the images of the brochure in order to underscore their point. Open space, key to desirable neighborhoods. The use category where bonuses were most generous and where they had the most significant impact on the shape of buildings and the life of the streets was in the commercial districts and in the high-rises in Manhattan. So here, let's enjoy a little foray into my favorite subject, skyscrapers. As we saw in the bar graphs, the 1961 law intended to control both density and future population numbers by capping building development. Lowering built density was, of course, a founding premise and a goal of the original 1916 zoning law, which established the first height and bulk limits on building in the United States. Before 1916, buildings could extend straight up into the sky along the boundaries of the streets and lots, and they did. Especially in lower Manhattan, as you see here in the financial district, where the physical crowding of buildings and people on sunless streets and in dark offices did indeed threaten the public health and safety, as well as, of course, real estate values. The 1916 zoning law imposed a restriction on the maximum volume or envelope of the building, requiring that the structure step back as it rose. The simple line diagrams developed by the architect and planner George B. Ford, who was the mastermind of the setback formula, you see here. And there were 5 variations based on the width of the street and the angle of the setback, applied in different districts or zones. The tower of unlimited height was allowed over 25% of the lot at its center. This latter point is hugely important because it created a profitably proportioned tall tower only on very large lots. The prophetic and practical significance of the setback formula and unrestricted towers was visualized in 1922 by the delineator Hugh Ferris in a set of widely known and extremely influential drawings he called the maximum mass of the zoning envelope. Ferris's powerful charcoal renderings extrapolated the zoning formula and the Ford diagrams into a vision of a future city of full-block, mountainous megastructures. So I'm reeling back to 1916 law here because it was this condition of congestion that the post-war modernist architects and planners sought to reform, and it was this conception of the future city that they feared. You can see that in some of the images. In the report of October 1950, The Plan for Rezoning New York, prepared by the consultants Harrison, Ballard, and Allen. And indeed, I'm tempted to argue here that the architects were haunted by Ferris's 1920s drawings, even 2 decades later, as you can see in the lower right-hand side. So as enacted, as we've seen in Hilary's slide, the 1961 zoning law dramatically reduced the maximum mass of the envelope for a commercial tower. It also altered formulas about the percentage of lot coverage, which allowed for the prismatic glass box or the sheer slab building that rose straight up, set back from the street in open space, a la the Seagram building. This was the contemporary aesthetic of the international style, as well as the product of new technologies of fluorescent lights, of air conditioning, and open plan office floor plates. The maximum FAR allowed for the densest districts was set at 15, in contrast to 25 FAR, equivalent to the Empire State Building, or even more for those pre-zoning towers. Further ensuring the future of the tower in the plaza formula was the incentive offered to developers to create public open spaces at street level in exchange for additional floor space in the sky. The bonus ratio was 10-to-1 for plazas and 3-to-1 for arcades. The resulting quasi-public plazas were designed, constructed, and permanently maintained by the developer at his expense. They became known as POPs, privately owned public spaces. So think of it this way. In a map of the public streets, the streets are white and the buildings are black, and these POP spaces are gray. Due to the current events, very current events, I suppose, in Zuccotti Park, many people are now familiar with the concept and the realities of POPs. Now, POPs were extremely profitable to developers. Jerold Kayden, who's the world expert on POPs, called them irresistible in a study that of more than 500 examples conducted with the Department of City Planning and the Municipal Arts Society. Published in 2000, and he quotes a rate of 40 or ratio of 48-to-1 in the rental revenue payback for each dollar invested in a public plaza. So we can debate if the public got sufficient benefit, especially early on, but later adjustments improved the quality and the oversight of bonus spaces, as I'm sure Alex will cover, if not briefly. So seen from the perspective of 1960, instituting the bonus or incentive device was a triumph. As Chairman James Felt explained, quote, "We are now saying for the first time in New York City that open space is not to be considered as a gouge here or a notch there, depriving builders of valuable floor space, but as a usable commodity worth more than the offices it replaces." So personally, I think the plaza bonuses were great, and they were a great bargain for the city, especially transformative in Lower Manhattan, where the dense urban fabric of aging office buildings was bound to change, or the district would have died off completely. The fortuitously interconnected open space of, say, 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza and 140 Broadway and 1 Liberty Plaza that you see here make up a path of sidewalk circulation, sunlight, and public amenities, including art, that vastly improved the urban experience downtown. In Midtown, the tower and the plaza approach. Here we go. And the map shows you 3 of the blocks that were opened up by 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza and 140 in the pre-zoning built-out sidewalk covering all space. So close to the end. In Midtown, the tower and the plaza approach presented a mixed record of good and bad urbanism on street level. You all walked past or through a Pops on the way here. I actually took this picture last week, and it's an illustration of the XYZ buildings that line up here because I took the wrong building, as a matter of fact, for the entrance. You didn't walk through this one. You walked through the one next door. But this space behind the building, one block to our north, if you had seen it as I did last Thursday, and took this picture at 2 o'clock on an Indian summer afternoon, I think you probably would have said, as I do, how perfectly lovely it was. Yep. So we ask, how can zoning accomplish and create great urbanism? In the words of Robert Stern in his magisterial history, New York 1960, quote, "The passage of the new zoning was post-war New York's pivotal architectural event, irrevocably changing the relationship between buildings and streets that had prevailed for over 300 years. By this, I think he meant that it was the solidity and the continuity of the street wall with its contiguous facades, filling out the block frontage lot by lot and the city block by block. And that was replaced in many districts, as in Midtown and Park Avenue, 6th Avenue, 3rd Avenue that we've seen. So, open space and density. I've argued that these were the preoccupations of the 1961 zoning reformers. Their clear point was open space is good and density is bad. This premise was as true for the skyscrapers commercial districts as it was for the superblock neighborhood housing projects, as Hilary showed us. And my second last slide here shows you their projections of an average city block, residential block, built out to the various residential densities as options R1 to R10. The dots on the interior, over on the left-hand side, are the people, and the dashes outside the blocks are the automobiles. The constraint on housing density, the text identifies as the concern for too few parking spaces and congested subway cars. I think we can all understand why these problems loomed large to the reformers of the 1950s and 60s, but I hope that planners today find this as wrong-headed as I do. So in the last slide here, I return to the 1959 chart that contrasts the old 1916 zoning law with the new improved 1961 zoning resolution. Some of the last slides I just showed, I suspect you feel, as I do, were reversed in terms of what they scorned and what we value highly in New York today. Does that perhaps also mean that the reformers were wrong about that they were wrong about the necessity of reducing density, at least reducing density as much as they did? So while New York will not be a city of 12 million people in the near future, we know that we expect to add 1 million by 2035, the question of how to arrange both open space and density seems to me the central question as we revisit the legacy and the influence of the 1961 zoning law for the city today and in the future. Thank you.
That's not my presentation. I'm here to talk about the work of 5 decades of the most creative and talented city planning department in the United States that took what these extraordinary presenters have explained and transformed it into a working document that is shaping the city today, and in particular to one of these people, Donald Elliott, who was the chairman of the Planning Commission from 1966 to 1973. Now, what they were doing was responding to a world that initially in 1916 thought about the bulk of the building, the density on the site, and the shape and uses that were allowed on that site, and had been transformed by the 61 ordinance into a series of categories which were supposed to provide added flexibility. You no longer had to build within that envelope. You could provide any number of different versions on the same site. In fact, it produced a cityscape something like this, which was nothing like the drawings in either the discussions of the 16 or the 61 ordinance, and one which increasingly disturbed the City Planning Commission and the staff of the department. And so they began to deal with it. And the basic idea that they dealt with was the idea of an incentive. The ordinance in 61 provided a bonus for doing the kind of building that the authors of that plan thought desirable, specifically more room for pedestrians. I would not call it plazas. I would call it planning for added room for pedestrians. They expected that added room. They simply gave it a bonus. Well, in fact, these privately owned public open spaces, which Jerold Kayden's book magnificently explains, created a new cityscape. And at first, some of the things that it did worked just fine. When you had talented architects and clients who wanted to create a nice plaza, they called it, they could. And some of the greatest architects produced something very different. If you go to the CBS building, for example, it's in a hole in the ground, it's set back from the street, and the entrance isn't even on 6th Avenue. Planning Commission had to deal with this. And over a period of years, the Commission adopted a series of rules to improve what the designers could do by providing different kinds of bonuses and different requirements for different kinds of public open space. Now explaining that we were no longer dealing with just room for pedestrians or the sidewalk. And you got places like this, not at all contemplated in 1961. The most significant of the things that they dealt with was, in fact, probably the response by Donald Elliott to try to save the constitutionality of landmarks preservation in the United States, and that is the transfer of unused development rights from a landmark to neighboring buildings. And that transfer of development rights allowed a building like this, the Siena, to be created by the church in the foreground, selling its development rights, and therefore not losing the value of its property, not being a regulatory taking of private property without compensation, because it could sell the development rights. Very simple, very easy. The Planning Commission continued to expand by saying we want better site plans and more open space, and proposed planned unit development. This is one of the earliest of them. This is Staten Island, by the way. We have almost none of them in the city of New York. The most important, even more important than landmarks, was the special district in the theater district. We were about to lose the engine of the New York City economy. It's tourist business, because the theaters were large sites, could be assembled by developers. Another one, to explain, a bonus was given for new theaters. 5 new theaters, the first after the Depression, were built as a result and continue to be thought about today. Well, there were special conditions everywhere, and there became a blizzard of special districts responding to the special interests of special neighborhoods, special businesses, and so on. Perhaps in response, the neighborhood said, that's not good enough. We want to have something that deals with the way we actually live. And contextual zoning came along, which tried to adjust what you could build to the neighbors and the rest of things. And in an attempt to be equitable, and we're going to hear more about that this afternoon, an inclusionary zoning bonus was introduced into the ordinance. There are issue after issue after issue that began to be dealt with creatively by the staff and the department and enacted by the commission. But some of the things that happened over the next half century were basically ignored. The first are federal, state, and city environmental regulations. They don't appear in the planning of anywhere in the zoning ordinance. Historic preservation regulations outside the zoning ordinance, although the commission has to send its opinion about the effect on land use to the city council. The first historic preservation in the United States, 1931 in Charleston, embodied in the zoning ordinance the historic preservation legislation. So already you now have 2 major things that are not in the comprehensive zoning. Because remember, 1961 was an attempt to create a comprehensive zoning ordinance that included everything. Computerization, the department under Amanda Burden has finally begun to put on the internet the ability to see what's in the zoning ordinance. It's a great achievement. And finally, Homeland Security. And I want to talk a little bit about that for a moment. That's the plaza at 140 Broadway as it originally was conceived. And now it's protecting against something, but it's no longer available for the public in quite the same way. And this is happening all over. In fact, Carol Willis had another picture like this. This is something that we really need to deal with because we gave a bonus for something. It's being taken away with no consideration whatsoever of the fact that this belonged to all of us. The planning simply can't keep up with the marketplace, and zoning can't either. And that becomes a challenge. When the market operates so quickly all over the city, you can't, given the way we operate, respond quickly. And it's important to deal with that. We can't keep up even with the Board of Standards and Appeals. Yes, under Amanda Burden, we rezoned Williamsburg, and we have done a great job with the waterfront. But before the rezoning took place, look at all the variances that were given by the Board of Standards and Appeals. So again, we need to start thinking in more dynamic terms. The ordinance itself is as complicated as a Rube Goldberg cartoon. Let me show you what I mean. I decided a couple of years ago to look at what's in the zoning handbook, and it's very easy. The new handbook is even better than the old one originally published by John Zuccotti, chairman in the 1970s, and much improved as it currently exists. I hope you'll buy one outside. It's very useful. But in fact, since 1961, the zoning ordinance now includes, just look how many pages, and look how many things in the index. We're talking about something that no ordinary human being can possibly consume. And when you look at the language, if you can understand that, you're doing better than I can. And I actually did something under that provision as a private citizen. The result is we are in the middle of a revolt, and it's national. It's a property rights backlash. And it comes in all sorts of forms, and it's not about zoning alone, it's about all aspects of planning, because people who own property are not responding to the neighborhoods, and the people who zone the property or restrict it are not responding to what people think are ordinary rights. The states of Florida, Oregon, Washington now have on the books laws that say that if a local government reduces what a property owner can do on the property, they have to pay compensation. Think about that in New York City and think about what it would do. So I issue a challenge to all of us. The great public realm is Paris. Paris started adopting regulations in the 18th century. And they adopted regulations that has created one of the great public realms. This is what we own, or the French own. It's where we shop, we do business, we meet people, we buy newspapers, we sit in a cafe, we also travel, we also deliver goods. It's a mixed-use public realm. And my challenge to the next set of speakers and to our discussion here is to come up with a third way of looking at zoning. And I believe the way can be found in Paris, and that is, let us rezone the city by thinking about what kind of public realm we want and making the regulations fit the street, not the lot. The park, not the buildings that are built around it, and the public buildings that we own and occupy every day, and not the private property around it. And I look forward to a lively conversation.
If the microphone works from here, if you could hear me, I won't get up to the lectern, but I want to thank all the panelists for both expostulation and taking the discussion to the next level about how what we've learned from 1916 and 1961 might influence the future. I also want to thank the Deputy Mayor for inspiring opening remarks. I was trying to think if there were not just 4 points, but remembering the neighborhood 5 points near City Hall, what would that fifth point have been? And perhaps it is this dialogue across time that we could learn from what the debates were in the last century and expand upon it. The format for the rest of our time here now is very simple. We'll talk for about half of what remains before 10:30, and then we'll throw it open to you all with questions that should be in the form of questions. If you're tempted to make a statement, put a question mark at the end of it and keep it short. But I'm going to start by jumping right in to a question about the 61 resolution, because we're here, after all, to celebrate it and to talk about, on the occasion of any anniversary, what the celebration means going forward if we're still together. Does the 61 zoning ordinance still exist? Does it still work, in your estimation? No particular sequence.
Well, I would argue that the 61 ordinance evolved, like the United States Constitution. You cannot look at it as a static document, just as you cannot look at a city as a static document. And it works better every time the Planning Commission adjusts it to existing conditions. And it works worse every time the Planning Commission responds to neighborhood pressure for things that they want because they don't want something else in their backyard. And I don't mean just NIMBYs. I mean, not over there either. That's note. Or note, not on planet Earth. And believe me, I have sat through hours of public hearings, and sometimes it's necessary to do that because the city will be better because of it. But it also can get worse. And so my answer to you is yes, so long as we continue to change it.
I would certainly second that. And I was surprised in doing my general research how much of the writing on zoning historically is excellent, because it's clear. It sets forth the principles, it defines zoning, and how that applies, as we heard in the introductory remarks, changes over time as well. But one of the critiques of zoning that I don't accept, but one hears over and over again, is the, well, it's kind of pull out the flashcard and say your taxes can be filed on this one postcard. Simplifying zoning, as Alex is saying, it seems to be not a realistic response to the way that zoning has evolved to meet these various challenges. So the call to simplify zoning is one that I think is ill-founded.
Well, I obviously don't agree. I think that the challenge of the form-based zoning, which I don't agree with, is that it can be done simply and easily. It may not be done on a postcard or even on a single sheet, but it certainly can be done less complicated and involving less pages of irrelevancies than what we have. What we have in the United States in general is an accretion of laws, and we don't get rid of the ones that don't make any sense anymore. We just add more. Well, it's time to clean it up.
Hilary, I'm going to just expand upon the first question to talk about how the city might have grown without this 61 resolution. As an historian, what were the aspects that in 61 replacing 16 and the things that had happened between time, you know, what did we gain from the 61 resolution that is irrevocably part of the contemporary discussion?
I think Carol drew our attention especially to what Alex re-described as more space for pedestrians. I think that was one of the most significant impacts on the city. I just want to make a comment about a distinction, an important distinction that was made early on about tools and techniques as opposed to vision. Alex, in a rousing way at the end, said we should think about zoning for the public realm, not for the building. Well, tools have embedded in them a certain way of seeing that already implies a value system. And FAR is exactly that, because FAR was a new invention. You know, it percolated in the planning world, RPA advanced it, but it was embodied in the law at this very moment. And then it compelled us to focus on the lot lines and on the building, right? I mean, we already were doing it, but it reinforced that. So we also, to pursue your idea, we have to rethink the analytic tools or the metrics that we use to describe the city around us.
Again, picking up on the introductory remarks from the Deputy Mayor, I would say that perhaps air rights are human and as of right is divine. Does incentive zoning work? Do the bonuses actually create value? Alex, you talked about the proposition of pedestrian space. Do we need zoning for tents, zoning for camping? Not just what's missing, how do we incentivize things that may be seen differentially over time?
If we start thinking about zoning for the public realm, we will change the way we look at this entirely. And I would argue that the great achievement of the 61 ordinance is that 95% of what's built in the city is built as of right. You go to the buildings department. I will not comment on how easy it is to get through the buildings department, but the rest of the country does what Jerold called discretion. We have almost no discretion except special conditions for special permits in special districts, and other than that, it's as of right, and the Commission never sees it. Therefore, the overall regulation becomes very important, and that makes us different from a city like Los Angeles or Boston, where discretion is very, very central to everything. And therefore, I would argue the zoning ordinance works because of that. We build all the time. Most people are able to put a porch on their building without going to the Planning Commission. Well, the Nolan case, which is the famous case in the coastline of California, took place specifically because a family couldn't put a porch on their building or remodel their kitchen. So, yes, it works.
I'm sort of surprised to hear Alex say this because I know he wrote a book called The American City, What Works Doesn't. And in the principles that he sets out, I think the most fundamental one is that the role of planning and government is to use public dollars in order to incentivize private development. And I'm totally in favor of bonus planning because I'm in favor of more density. So I think that anything that you do in order to create more density intelligently is and unleashes private investment in order to do that, that commodity, as James Felt talks about it, that commodity is something that government has in order to spend for the public good.
Carol, there isn't 1 cent that is spent by the public in zoning. It's a regulatory device. I am all for spending money on our infrastructure. I am for creating public parks. The city of New York spends billions of dollars and as a widespread parks system. We cover 26% of the territory of New York because we spent money on it. Zoning doesn't spend a penny except on the staff of the agency. And that's why I think that my definition still holds. And if we spend money on our streets, and you can see the great work Jeanette Sadiq Khan is doing in an attempt to invest in it, if we also rezoned along with it, we would begin to have a world that I'm talking about.
I don't disagree with that, but I do think that public space, in a sense, for government is a commodity that can be leveraged in private development.
Hilary?
I concur. I think this bonus zoning was the most significant, long-lasting contribution of 1961. Yeah. We saw under Lindsay and the Urban Design Group bolder interpretations of or recognition of what it could accomplish, and that reconceptualized zoning not just as a set of restrictions, but as opportunities to incentivize the public goods that we valued.
Open it up to questions from the audience. I think there's a microphone. Thank you. Gentleman in the 5th row.
Thank you. I have a question for Alex. Is it on?
Speak louder.
And into it.
I do have a question for Alex. On the one hand, you favor as-of-right use in order to avoid bureaucratic delays and trigger entrepreneurial energy and the like, and have all the process go forward as you described. On the other hand, you don't want to do this on the basis of the parcel itself. You want to define the as-of-right rules, I gather, with respect to the surrounding municipal environment. What kind of rules would you fashion that would replace FAR in order to accomplish that goal and still permit as-of-right energy to go forward?
Well, ironically, and I happen to know that Carol agrees with me in this. I don't know about Hilary, but I bet she'd jump on it too. The 16 ordinance did more to deal with the public realm than the 61 ordinance, because if you look at Park Avenue, you will see it's a multiple of street width. And the multiple of street width is the basis of all the regulation in Paris. And that's an example of the sort of thing to do. But the reason that the as-of-right is important, you can see in Washington for the next 2 weeks. Making decisions is very tough. If you have to make a decision that determines what the character of the public realm is, then you let the private market respond, and it will. And I think it's very important to save those special permits for truly special situations, and they do exist. But I think we've got to be careful about it. And then there are times we have to change the ordinance. One of the things that Hilary mentioned, and Carol both, was what I think is a fundamental flaw in the thinking of the 16 and the 61 ordinance, and that was that there was an ultimate build-out. You know, we don't know where the market is going to build. If you had asked me whether in Williamsburg we would have a whole new population when I was the Deputy Housing Commissioner in 1965, I would have said, you've got to be kidding. And most of you know what I'm talking about. So what's the ultimate build-out? We don't know. And therefore, if you create a straitjacket of 9 million, because you expect a 9 million population, you're creating an impossible situation for the market. You've got to have multiples, because not only are you going to change where you build, but the market is going to move around in it, and lots of properties are never going to get built. And therefore, the straitjacket is eliminating huge areas where the market doesn't work. In the 80s, nobody would build in the South Bronx. In the next decade, they will, and are doing so now.
Next question, in the back, sir.
I wonder if the panel could address the use innovations of the 61 zoning resolution, because it abandoned cumulative zoning and it began the policy of preserving land for urban manufacturing, which some have argued has had a steep cost. And of course, post-61, there were other things that were done, like restricting where supermarkets and big boxes could locate. And isn't there a use implication of the zoning resolution that should be more fully discussed?
Thank you, Michael.
Well, I think that a lot of the use categories no longer make sense. We have environmental laws. Why do we need to separate land uses? We do have problems of traffic, the delivery of trucks, which nobody talks about. We only talk about private automobiles. But I think we could get rid of lots of those categories, and we'd better come to terms with the fact that we are not going to have a large manufacturing base in the city. Take a look at your brochure and see how many manufacturing jobs we have left, and then look at the amount of land we have. In fact, all that waterfront parkland we're creating in Brooklyn and Queens and Manhattan is possible only because we have gone from a city that had a huge manufacturing base, nearly 1 million manufacturing jobs at the beginning of the century. That's all gone.
Let me redirect, Michael, your question, because it seems to me that implicit in it is the question of mixed use. And if we are seeing increasingly buildings in neighborhoods that are mixed use, to the segregation of land uses, even within a skyscraper, still pertain, or is it a free-for-all? And I don't know if, Carol, you want to answer
Sure.
that question in a different way.
Well, I think, following on Alex, I think we need to rethink really what manufacturing means. And an example of that is we're doing a new exhibition on newspaper buildings from the 1870s through today. Mm-hmm. And at that point in 1875, the New York Tribune building, tallest building in the city, was a vertical urban factory. They printed with presses in the basement. They hot lead was poured from the linotype machine into the slugs, and that was manufacturing at the same time that the paper was written and edited and all within the same structure, which was also speculative office space that helped to pay for the real estate investment. So we don't print the New York Times on 43rd Street anymore since 1997, but we still manufacture the New York Times in the city. So I think, given Google and their headquarters, I mean, we think, what really is manufacturing today in the publishing industry, for example?
It's wonderfully ironic that here we are in a Plaza and Park building, as you pointed out, and McGraw-Hill, to whom we owe a debt of gratitude for this wonderful auditorium and the generosity that enables us to be here, also built the Raymond Hood building in 1930, which was the classic set-back building. And whether or not it was a model for what Ayn Rand was describing in The Fountainhead, we don't have to go there exactly, but it seems to me that we have two great examples by McGraw-Hill that are object lessons on how to interpret zoning and do them both.
The Hood building was mixed-use manufacturing building.
Which is why I mentioned it, because it was that far west because of zoning.
Right.
Question in the front.
Thank you all so much. This is fascinating. My grandfather, Stanley Rappaport, built a Mitchell-Lama building on the Upper West Side. It was finished in 1967, and it's still there, called Independence House. And basically, that comes out of the conventions of the West Side Urban Renewal, some planning, obviously, because it was also restricted in its covenants in terms of the land use. But the reason I'm saying that is, with today's building information modeling, and the ability to scan with point clouds all the buildings in the city, not only do a geospatial review, but really no for fire department use and everything.
With respect, sir, can you get to the question? I mean, I know we just don't have, we have 5 minutes left, so you have a specific
Do you
question.
see a way to use this technology as a way to encourage the metrics that you mentioned in terms of what the public realm should really do, like they did in the 60s with the Mitchell-Lama program? Sorry, that was a long question.
Thank you.
Well, the public realm has activities in it, and one of the things we can use cameras today to do is to do traffic counts of people, traffic counts of taxis, buses, even private automobiles. And so I would say that you can use Google already to see what's on the street, and how are you going to change it? Now, that means that the people who are making decisions have to have the capacity to use it, and we're in transition. I can do some of that, but most of it I'm the wrong generation to do. My students will all be able to do that, and I think we need to start thinking about how we manage property and how we manage our public realm that way.
Yes, sir.
Zoning has benefited...
Talk into the mic a little bit. Sorry. Talk more directly into the microphone, please.
Zoning has benefited, by and large, landowners that has large parcels, bonuses and the like, because of the critical mass and so forth. My question is, can zoning be made responsive to individual smaller owners that may own a 25 by 100 lot, but collectively they can transform the fabric of a city in ways perhaps more important than a large developer that may own a city block? That's my question.
Thank you.
Frankly, I think that FAR took away the advantage of very large lots. And so, of course, larger property owners are going to be able to wield more influence. But it seems to me that transferable air rights and all is a way for small units on a single lot to be repaid with the possible disadvantage they have. But apropos to those, the full build-out zoning that actually never would have happened under the assumptions of the 1950s planners, it seems to me that really the glory of New York in the 1916 zoning law is a single building on a single lot. I mean, you look across the city and that incredible diversity, the kind of heterogeneity that could never be imitated by anything other than the process of capitalism that plays itself out in New York. That is New York's identity, it seems to me. And so I wouldn't want to change anything about that. I think little parcels are great. You can be a holdout, that's what you can be. Yeah.
I think we have time for two more questions. Two more questions and then some closing remarks, maybe a question for you all. Next question. Oh, there we are. Yes. Please.
Okay. Why I think there's a problem with homogeneity in New York City. We have one vision and we apply it to all neighborhoods, and I've heard talks by city planning. Why not try different solutions, different times, different places, so that we can get competing visual and functioning communities in New York City?
I thought we did.
Yeah.
I think part of the complexity and the enormity of zoning is an attempt to allow for some variety. I guess the premise of homogeneity is one that I would question.
So I'm getting the time's up signal, so I'm going to ask the last question, not of our panelists, but of you all. We've heard a lot about the history of zoning and its changes over time and how these current zoning and the attitude and capabilities and talented city planning are changing the city into the future. I think, Carol, you sort of posited a density question of the highest order. We've seen contextual zoning and down zoning. We've seen 40 different, we've seen the 61 resolution used as a zoning tool. I'm going to ask by poll, by straw poll, and I don't think anyone's recording it. Can we, by acclamation, give city planning a round of applause for everything they're doing with the 61 zoning resolution? Or not? Abstentions? Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Jerold. We're very privileged to have been here for this discussion and look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you, panelists.
I just want to thank Rick and Carol and Alex and Hilary for taking us all the way back to 1916, bringing us up to 61 and beyond, focusing on the public realm, everything from the public realm to nope. So we have about 10 minutes just to take a break. Please return to your seats at about 10:40 so we can start the Dan Doctoroff panel on time. The doors should open now, and stretch your legs.